Happy Wednesday evening, everybody. Good evening. It's Simon Godwin. I'm here, the Artistic Director, of course, of the Shakespeare Theatre Company, welcoming you to another evening with The Bard. I hope you had a great 4th of July holiday weekend. It was my first 4th of July holiday weekend here in America, and it was exciting to celebrate. Perhaps not quite in the way that everyone is used to, but certainly it was fun to get involved in the way that was possible. Well, before we dive in this evening, I would like to thank Nick and Marla Allard, who have graciously sponsored tonight's episode. Nick and Marla, we are thrilled that you are with us tonight from your beautiful home in Georgetown. I'm personally grateful for all your friendship and your support. The Shakespeare Hour is produced as part of our larger artistic initiative, Shakespeare Everywhere, which is in turn sponsored by the remarkable Beach Street Foundation. You can see that my backdrop this evening has changed. I am broadcasting from the Hill School in Middleburg, who have very kindly opened their doors to me this evening. Hunt Lyman and my new friend Trevor Lord, thank you so much for welcoming me to your school tonight. I also want to give a shout out to my old friends at Rectortown Methodist Church. To those of you from the congregation who are watching, hello. Well, we have, as usual, an excellent lineup of guests this evening, and I am thrilled to introduce them. So, first of all, Dr. Richard McCoy, Professor of English at Queen's College and the Graduate Centre of CUNY, and the author of 2013's book, Faith in Shakespeare. Richard, are you there?
I am.
Hi, Richard, how are you?
I'm fine.
Good. Where are you calling in from this evening?
I'm calling from Manhattan, Upper West Side.
Okay, very nice. How are things in the city these days? Do they feel calmer?
They do feel calmer, and indeed. It's very relaxed. West End Avenue has closed between 86th Street and 96th Street. So wow. We treat it as our terrazzo.
Okay, terrific. Well, welcome to the show, and I look forward to talking to you about Shakespeare and clowns.
Yes.
Great. Jacob Ming-Trent, Lucille Lortel Award winner, who has been seen on Broadway and stages all across the US, including the Public, TFANA, and Yale Rep, just to name a few. You can also see him now on HBO's Watchmen. Hello, Jacob.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are things?
I'm great. Things are good.
That's great. And where are you calling in from tonight?
I'm calling from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay, I've never been to Pittsburgh. Can you describe it to me in a sentence?
Well, yes. It is the home of the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Okay, the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Mm-hmm.
And they are a sports team?
They're a football team.
Okay, very good. So slowly I'm accruing, immense knowledge of America during this program.
Good.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, more in a moment, Jacob. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Awesome.
And finally, I'd like to introduce Tony Award winner, iconic American actor, clown, and comedian, Bill Irwin. Hello, Bill. No, Bill, I think you might be muted. I think. Yep.
Hello, Simon. Hello, gentlemen. Grand to be with you.
Great to see you, Bill. Well, that's our first banana skin of the show. I'm sure there will be many more to discuss. And Bill, where are you calling from tonight?
My wife and I have been in lockdown in Manhattan since the pandemic began, but tonight I'm in Woodstock, New York, because we're socially distancing in a visit to the country.
Oh, how exciting. Okay, wonderful. And it's beautiful there, it's rural?
Midsummer Night's Dream, yes.
Okay, terrific. And actually, I'm going to take this moment, if I may, to ask you, Bill, if you were a Shakespearean character this evening, inside, as it were, who do you feel like?
At this moment, one window on your screen, I feel like Trinculo, a guy who's not quite sure what his function is and whether he'll be accepted by the other guys.
Okay.
That's the role I feel at this moment.
Yeah. Thank you, Bill. Terrific. I'm going to flow back to Richard. Can I ask you, Richard, what character from Shakespeare you're feeling like this evening?
I'm feeling like William in As You Like It, who is the namesake of William Shakespeare, of course, and rival to Touchstone for Audrey's affections. And he's blown off by Touchstone, the professional clown.
Okay, interesting, very complicated. Thank you,
Yeah.
rich. And let me ask Jacob, if I may, as well, the character that you are tonight, Jacob?
Well, I'm always Sir Toby Belch. I feel like I'm just constantly Sir Toby.
Great,
So.
love that. Okay, terrific. Well, it's probably time for me to introduce Drew, my colleague and co-host, Drew Lichtenberg, STC's resident dramaturg and literary manager. Hello, Drew.
Hello, Simon.
Okay, how are you doing?
I am doing just dandy. And before we get started, I want to remind everyone tuning in for the first time, or if you're tuning in again, of these special features, because this is a live taping tonight. So there is a Q&A button on your screen, which you can use to ask Jacob or Bill or Richard or indeed me and Simon anything you want, so long as it is about Shakespeare and clowns. And there is also a chat button with which you can share your clown thoughts with other people who are indeed listening in. And if we don't get to your question, be rest assured, we will answer your question. There is a Friday mailbag newsletter that will put all questions regarding Shakespeare and clowns to rest once and for all. Which brings me to tonight's theme, Shakespeare and clowns. One of the questions we got last week, actually, when we were discussing Shakespeare's life, was about where did Shakespeare get all of his Commedia dell'arte influences from? If he went to grammar school in Stratford, where he read Seneca and Plautus and all these Roman classics, what about all the other stuff in Shakespeare that's not classical? So tonight's discussion is going to start to answer that question about Shakespeare's relationship to popular, comic, folk, theatrical traditions. Now, clown is obviously an enormous subject. It can mean a lot of different things depending on who you're talking to and in what country you're talking to that person. God forbid you go up to a French mime and tell him that he's a clown. So I thought it would be good to start our discussion. We will go chronologically as we did last week, but I thought it would be good to start our discussion hearing from each of our guests about their definition maybe of clown, or the angle that they're going to take in discussing clowns tonight. And I think, Richard, it might be most appropriate to start with you.
Okay. First of all, the word clown is coincided with Shakespeare's birth and its introduction to the English language. It was first used according to the OED the year before Shakespeare was born. It means essentially a clod or a country bumpkin. And it seems to be a response to a major transition in 16th century England, which is to say a huge number of provincials moved to the capital city, London, quadrupling London's population by the end of the 16th century. And Shakespeare was one of those provincials from Warwickshire who moved from Stratford upon Avon. And he was drawn to London by the startup entertainment industry. So hence I invoked his character in As You Like It, William, as a kind of simpleton who is dismissed as a clown by the professional jester Touchstone and blown off in that play.
So in other words, what you're saying is that Shakespeare was a clown, or would have been seen
Well, he was, through a sort of false etymology, it was seen to be a kind of rustic figure. it was in fact Low German, but its origins. But really, it was seen as a colonial, someone who was a peasant who farmed in the country.
Which, Jacob, I'm curious to hear from you. What does clown mean to you, or what does Shakespeare clown mean to you?
Wow, I'm really, Mr. McCoy just really blew my mind. So I'm like, that's a lot to take in. What clown means to me, clown can be so many things, you know, joy, laughter, a deep thought. Clowns are penetrating, in my opinion, you know, in a lot of different ways. So when I'm playing them, I'm always looking to get a reaction out of people, whether or not it's just a laugh or a turn of the head, or, you know what I mean? Maybe just a little tear as well. You know, you never know.
And Bill, the same question or questions for you. What does clown mean to you, and what does Shakespearean clown mean to you?
Well, it's a charged word, as the other gentlemen have said. My wife often says, maybe we'll just leave off the word clown when we're applying for a loan. What do you think? Even though I proudly embrace the craft of the clown, I'm either an actor/clown or a clown/actor, depending on what's winning at any moment in the struggle within my soul. The word clown, interestingly, though, for me, and in the way I've made a living, has a 19th and 20th century meaning, like a guy or a woman who can go out and hold a circus ring or hold a stage for a few minutes between acts or for a longer time. The great stage clowns did, you know, hold evenings, whereas clowns in circuses are often just a couple beats between as equipment is being changed. The Shakespearean clowns, I'm here to listen. I'm thrilled that we have this lens that you guys have set up between the clown roles that Will Kemp played and the clown roles that Robert Armin played. And that's really illuminating to me, and I'm eager to hear more. So it's a charged word, and I'm not in charge of it much of the time.
So it's good if you are calling yourself a clown, but maybe if somebody else calls you a clown, it can...
Well said, yeah. During the Vietnam War, my mother hated Nixon for everything he did, but especially when he said, well, you clowns in charge. She said, my son is a clown. And so the word in everybody's parlance means different things, and it has a lot of different charge.
And it's interesting you bring up politics, because we actually have a question already coming in over the transom from Myron, quoting from Marianne Trump Berry's forthcoming book, where she describes her uncle, Donald Trump, as a, quote, clown. And her question for our panel is, what Shakespearean clown does the president most resemble? Nate, Bill, you have your hand raised.
No, I'm going to defer to the other gentleman.
Maybe we can just let that question marinate in the ether and come back to it later tonight. Also, Bill, you mentioned that we have all male guests tonight. And it's one of the things that maybe we'll also discuss is that we always ask a variety of people. We happen to end up with an all-male panel tonight for the first time in the series. It seems to me that there's something about Shakespearean clown that assumes a male cast. You can certainly cast female actors as clowns, but it almost feels, well, it feels off in a way, or it feels mean-spirited sometimes to see women play the role of a Shakespearean clown. So that's, I think Simon and I have discussed, we will have a second panel of all female guests about Shakespeare's funny women, Shakespeare's female comic heroines, as a way of continuing this conversation. Also, Bill, as you said, we have this frame that we're going to apply chronologically. It seems like Shakespeare's clowns occupied the first half of his career and then the second half of his career, and that there are different types of clowns. Mostly Will Kemp, who was the company clown in the first half of his career with the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and then Robert Armin, who played different kinds of clowns in the second half of his career. I think before we get to those two clowns, though, I'm interested in hearing, Richard, where you think Shakespeare's clowns come from. What kind of theatrical traditions would he have been exposed to in the 1570s, 1580s when he was a young man? along with the invention of the word clown, as you have blown all of our minds tonight, what would you have seen that would have influenced his dramaturgy?
Yeah. First of all, there's the Fool, which is goes back to Middle English, and that the natural fool was a genuine idiot, but indeed the word natural was for a long time a synonym for a person with impaired intelligence. But an artificial fool was someone who professionally, self-consciously feigned stupidity to entertain his audience as a jester. And professionals often blurred the distinction as a protective defense, because a professional fool could speak truth to power, but still he's just a fool and he's only fooling or joking. The other principal source for this was festive holidays. And there's a great book by C.L. Barber called Shakespeare's Festive Comedy, where he talks about Twelfth Night, and which is linked to the 12 days of Christmas and the last night of traditional revels and rituals of inversion. Midsummer Night's Dream both refers to May Day, which is a fertility rite, and Midsummer Eve, which is summer solstice. And again, and finally, Commedia dell'arte. There was a group of professional actors from Italy who came and entertained Elizabeth in the 1570s. Actually, Ben Jonson explicitly refers to that, to Commedia in Volpone. Shakespeare also refers to, in The Taming of the Shrew, at the beginning of his career, with Gremio as a sort of pantaloon figure, the pantalone. And Dr. Pinch in The Comedy of Errors is the dottore. All of those are sources for Shakespeare's comedy.
And, we had a question from Peter. Please distinguish between the clown and the fool. Intuitively, they seem very different. It sounds like what you're saying, Richard, is that the clown is a rustic, a clod, a peasant, a simpleton, or at least that's what the word originally meant before it acquired 19th and 20th century connotations. And the fool is sort of the court jester at the court in medieval times who would pretend to be a simpleton in order to speak truth to power. I'm wondering, Jacob and Bill, if you have thoughts on this divide between the clown and the fool.
Jacob.
Thank you, Bill. It's interesting because a long time ago I had the chance to play Festi. So I think Festi he's a fool, correct, Richard?
In Olivia's household, he plays the role of the fool. Is that right?
Yeah. And he's a very sophisticated fool.
Jacob, you're muted. It sounded like you were going to say something very profound about Festi there.
I'm really good at sounding like I'm going to say something profound, and you saw how I passed that off to Mr. McCoy. I'm quite good at that. I think, Festi is a clear example of a fool. And then to me, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. McCoy, but, Bottom would be a clown, a more of a natural clown.
Well, you speak, Bill has his hand raised.
Gents, I was just going to ask if this makes any sense. In clown body language, this might be the way a fool would wear a hat, this way, a clown. Is often the clown is trying to do something or feels he's quite good at something that he doesn't quite have. Whereas a fool is often offering something that maybe he's down to people not quite as sharp as him. That's a feeling I often get from the play.
Yeah.
So there's a difference also in intelligence, that the clown goes upwards in intelligence and the fool goes downwards. We're developing a whole taxonomy here of clown. I love it. Well, you mentioned Bottom. Bottom, most people believe, was played by Will Kemp, who was the first of Shakespeare's clowns. And Richard has actually identified a famous passage by Bottom, which I think, Jacob, if you're ready, if you want to prepare yourself, you can read for us and then we can discuss. Are you ready?
I am ready. I am ready. This will ask some tears in the true performing of it. If I do it, let the audience look to their eyes. I will move storms. I will condole in some measure. To the rest, yet my chief humor is for a tyrant. I can play Hercules rarely, or a part to tear a cat in to make all split. The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far, and make and mar these foolish fates. This was lofty. Now name the, rest of prayers. This is Hercules' vein, the tyrant's vein. A lover is more condoling? I don't know. There you go.
Yeah, we're all clapping snapping our fingers. And
Yeah.
And there's a question from Simon, not Simon Godwin, but our viewer Simon. It's my impression that in Shakespeare's time, clowning was a bigger part of productions. You think that has changed because we see the plays as high culture and sacred compared to mass entertainment in the Elizabethan era? And it's interesting that in Midsummer Night's Dream, you have the clowns occupying their whole plot, basically. You have the mechanicals alongside the lovers, alongside the royals, alongside the fairies. And the way Shakespeare uses clowns in his plays is always to reflect on other aspects of the plays. He does this his whole career. Simon, you had your hand raised with a thought.
Well, I just wanted to speak to that because I think, I don't know whether folks in the audience and our guests would agree with this, but I think as a director of Shakespeare today, the comic material in the plays is very, very difficult to make work. I think it's the first thing that as a director, sadly, we end up cutting, simply because a lot of the references seem so topical, seem so specific to the moment in time when those plays were first written, that it's really hard to translate the comic kind of repartee to an audience now. I think what's terrific, as we've just seen about Bottom, is that he is a character with a role in the story within certain kind of defined parameters, which means we can really get on board and travel on that journey with him. Whereas some of the other ones, I mean, like Feste, there's a lot of material when I recently directed Twelfth Night, which we just couldn't make work. And it's so stressful for the actor who's given those lines very often because they feel under great obligation to be funny, which, as we know, is one of the most stressful things to have to ask to be of anything. And it does just seem simple to cut them. The other thing that is, I think, also challenging is that it's so helpful to learn this definition that the clown is a rustic. Because in a scene like Antony and Cleopatra, the very end of the play, a figure defined as the clown enters with figs, under which is the asp with which Cleopatra will kill herself. So it's really the tragic climax of the play. And the clown, in quotation marks, enters and basically has a lot of rude jokes about snakes and figs, and it's full of innuendo and strange kind of bawdy humor. But it sits very uneasily with us as a contemporary audience because we think, why is it now meant to be kind of rude and funny? Surely I'm meant to be crying or getting ready to cry. Now, of course, as Jacob said at the beginning, the great comic presences in our lives can move on a dime between comedy, laughing, and crying. Yet sometimes some of Shakespeare's great collisions can be very challenging for tone and also for content. And that's why I think they can remain a puzzle for us right now.
Well, and in that scene, and Jacob, you have your hand raised, what's funny, I think, to Shakespeare's original audience is the fact that Bottom is playing a scene from Ovid, Pyramus and Thisbe, and he's, in a rustic way, he's mangling all the pronunciations. Like he's saying Phoebus instead of Phoebus. He's saying Hercules instead of Hercules. He's kind of doing damage to the highbrow classical tradition with his rustic simpleton language. Isn't that right, Richard?
Yes, that is absolutely right. And their aspirations and their invisible conviction that he is going to be so convincing an actor that he's going to have to assure the audience that he's not actually Pyramus, and that Thisbe isn't Thisbe, and the lion isn't a lion. I took a clown course, which was way outside my comfort zone, with Andy Grotloischen and from Fiasco, and Zach Fine also from Fiasco, after I'd seen them in Two Gentlemen of Verona, Andy playing Lance, and Zach the dog, which was a great routine. And I chose that speech of Bottom's as my my speech to deliver in that class. As I said, it was way outside my comfort zone, and I soon realized that I could not aspire to do the clown act, which Jacob obviously did brilliantly in that regard. So
it seems like we can start to identify some of Will Kemp's characteristics, or the clown characteristics, the mangling of highbrow language, a certain kind of physical comedy. Simon also asks about Will Kemp's famous Morris dancing. He was famous for his dancing of jigs, and I believe he Morris danced all the way to Norwich for the end of his life after he left Shakespeare's company, with a lot of drinking along the way and stopping at inns. Yeah, Jacob.
Yeah, I want to say, from an actor's point of view, I think Simon is correct. It can be difficult because the references are old. Most people do not know them. So I think the actor playing the clown has to make a very strong decision to recognize who he or she is performing for, and go ahead and get the laugh. Sometimes I believe we're too reverential of the text when it comes to the clown. And there's a natural friction between the clown and the play, the actor and the writer in Shakespeare. It's a natural friction that I think we don't allow ourselves to exploit enough. Shakespeare in Hamlet talks about this. And I think he would maybe have been more mad at Kent than he was at Irwin. But I find myself, when I'm playing more of the Kemp clowns, that I will go ahead and use some references from today. I will go ahead and do some things, because if you lose, I don't know why we're this reverential, but we lose the audience, and we're just happy to be right instead of be in connection with the people. That's what I want to say.
Bill, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's really, that's a great phrase that Jacob uses. There's some friction with the play that the clown roles often have, and yet you don't want so much friction that everything falls apart. What we found, interestingly, when we were putting together the mechanicals for the film version of Midsummer Night's Dream, Kevin Kline was Bottom, and we were all hoping to get our licks in as character actors, but we knew that the camera's going to be going like this, and it's going to be chaos if we're all trying. What cohered us magically one day, we look back and think, is that we all looked to Bottom as, oh, he's an actor. All of us cohered looking at this guy, the fellow work guy that we thought should really be in show business. He is so good. And so it made us a cohered band that we could then, as a group, have friction against the very complex story, as opposed to each of us trying individually, which you do see on stage.
So some more questions before we leave Will Kemp. Why did he leave Shakespeare's company? how much of what we have of Kemp in Shakespeare's plays do you think he improvised versus Shakespeare having written it down? And there was the third one, but I want Richard maybe to weigh in and our actors, because I think you're identifying something that's essential for Shakespeare's clowns to work, is that you have to not be reverential towards the text.
Yeah. I think of him playing Dogberry in Much Ado in 1598, the year before he left. And he's dismissed as a bumbling fool, but he's still vindicated because, as one villain subsequently tells the superiors, what your wisdoms could not discover, these shallow fools have brought to light, and they solve the problem. So that, in some sense, they're proven to be a wise fool, which I'll talk more about later. He probably left because he was used to being a star on his own, and he was continually operating as a solo act, apart from the Lord Chamberlain's men. He left to take his song and dance routine on the road, as commemorated in Kemp's 9 Days Wonder. And he traveled over the Alps. But it was thought that people were, and he probably did improvise way too much. And it's thought that he's the basis of Hamlet's attack on "Let those that play your clowns speak no more than is set down for them," because he was continually improvising.
So sort of like when rock bands split up, it was creative differences. Bill, you had a point you were going to.
That's a good reference. Yes, I want to throw this out. It may be a bombshell, or it may not. But how much do we think, Richard, and anybody, that the clowns really contributed to these plays? And it raises the whole question of authorship. Do we think that a guy named Will Shakespeare wrote every one of those words that's in the play with a quill pen, or was there an amalgamation of stuff? Was Will Kemp's solo act, does it survive through a lot of the Shakespeare plays?
This is super tasty, and before we get to that, I wonder, Simon, if you can give us a few quick words about STC membership.
Yes, my goodness me, I'm still just, I'm here grappling about friction. It's such a brilliant question, as you say, brilliant praise, and I'm really haunted by this thing, which is sort of a bigger question, in fact, about how much license do we all have to change Shakespeare. It's a big debate. I remember, I think I've spoken on the show before about Peter Hall, going to a talk by Peter Hall shortly before Peter Hall died, the great British theatre director, the founder of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and saying that, look, soon Shakespeare is going to become like Chaucer. His language is going to get harder and harder and harder and harder. And so how do we as a community deal with that? And I think that the clown still gives us space and license for a playful audaciousness, which does become a bridge between the plays and the people watching them, if we get it right. And I think it's a fascinating area of discussion. And I personally always want a clown to feel excited and audacious and reckless and a bit brave in those areas. But look, we are indeed on midway through the show, and I'm just going to say a couple of small things. Many of our Shakespeare Hour viewers are also members of the Shakespeare Theatre Company. And as we near the end of our fiscal year, now is a great time to help us by renewing your membership, which will be matched by a generous trustee, doubling your impact during these challenging times. Now look, my colleagues, you might have read this, in the UK art scene received this week a bailout of $2 billion from the UK government to help arts organisations. We may not be able to reach that figure altogether, but as individuals, strengthening your commitment to the theatre is the very best way of keeping classical theatre alive in Washington, DC, and indeed in the nation. So thank you for your generosity. it's back to you, Drew.
Yeah, so before we get to Robert Armin and the kind of wise fool, I wonder if we can come back to Bill's provocation about authorship and how much did his company add to his plays. And inspired by last week's conversation, I actually fired up a couple episodes of Upstart Crow, which Jonathan Bate is such a huge fan of, which I actually highly recommend. It's very, very accurate in many of its historical details. But it also does have this provocation of, you know, Anne Hathaway offering him notes. The Will Armin character is the Will Kemp character is very arrogant. He's kind of like a Ricky Gervais of 1590 with the irritating laugh, or idiosyncratic laugh, I should say. Yeah, what do we think of the collective genius versus the individual genius of Shakespeare? Bill?
And I just throw this in without a shred of scholarship and very little reading, but just by instinct, I feel like the mass of that work could not have been created by one guy with a pen. And you know, all the great cultural endeavors that you can look at in history, the Renaissance paintings, big blockbuster Hollywood movies, they may have an auteur name on it, but they're the work of many, many people. And it's just my instinct, without knowing a thing about it, that's kind of somehow how the Globe Theater worked. A lot
yes,
going on.
I want to speak to that because I think there's something smart about that, but I think there might be a kind of midway through that in terms of, it seems like what we can tell is that Will Kemp was a member of the ensemble that Shakespeare himself was part of. So we know that Shakespeare was acting. He was probably played the ghost in the original Hamlet. So he was a man of the theatre, and he recognized in others the contributions they could make. So I get the feeling that he was going home and he was writing stuff inspired by what you or Jacob could do, what he knew you could do well. And I suspect that that was then added to and amplified by the individual actor. But then when Will Kemp falls out, because as you say, he gets too grand, he's just too expensive, or he's too frustrated, he leaves. A new guy comes in with his own talents. This Armin with slightly different vibe. And I think what Shakespeare does is to go, here's a new collaborator. How do I start writing material for this new guy that's joined my company? So he's inspired by the energies that the actors are bringing, much like he's inspired by Burbage, this extraordinary lead actor that was going to be playing Hamlet and Richard III and even Othello. That there was something about what Burbage was bringing, not necessarily what he was writing, but what he was bringing, that Shakespeare was so alive to. And I think of Shakespeare watching that moment that you described, all the mechanicals looking up at bottom in your film and going, that happened kind of naturally. I'm going to go home and write that tonight. I'm going to write that in. But he was not an ivory tower writer. Of that, I'm certain. He was a writer that was deeply entrenched in his company of actors.
And if you look at the Kemp characters like Bottom or Costard in Love's Labour's Lost or Dogberry, they tend to be somewhat pompous and full of themselves, and they have an exaggerated sense of their own importance in the world of the play, which feels like Shakespeare writing for the talents of his collaborator and also kind of, you know, getting in some digs. Jacob, you had a finger raised, but I think we should maybe move on to Armin and hear the Fool in Lear. But Jacob, you first.
Yeah, I think Simon, you crystallized something, and something Bill said as well. This idea that the responsibility of the clown, you're asking the clown to bring a certain level of energy, a certain level of tact, but the clown can't lose track of the greater piece. And it sounds like maybe Kemp did that at some point, and that was the break. I think you guys have crystallized something, I think, for the audience. That is the challenge. That is the challenge. That's what makes this difficult work. Of course, when you see it, you have a great joy watching it. But those actors that are playing those clowns are navigating a really thin tightrope.
Exactly, if I may say. And I think what Bill was interesting to talk about circus, because the circus it does not have narrative. So in some sense, the clown is liberated from having to serve a narrative. It can just do a routine. And I think when you're a clown in a story, it's very complicated because you want to be resonant with the theme and you want to be sensitive to the momentum of the narrative. And it's about how to find that balance between your routine and your storytelling. That's the really interesting tightrope.
We had one question about who was it who played Falstaff and whether Falstaff played a clown. And I think that's a good case in point of Falstaff can dominate the play to the detriment of everyone else in the play. Sort of, and what the director thinks about Falstaff is a measure of how prominently Falstaff is featured in the play. It doesn't seem accidental that Kemp leaves the company and Falstaff is killed off stage in Henry V. Richard, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, the chronology suggests that, you know, since he left in 1599, that he probably did play Falstaff. And then he's killed off. And I just would add that I can't think of a more collaborative enterprise than theater, where everyone, you know, it's a collective enterprise. And of course, we've learned a great deal about Shakespeare as a collaborator over the last 2 decades.
Indeed, Shakespeare was not the sole author of his plays, as we now have proven by science and data analysis. But Bill, I wonder if you can put on your fool hat and read us some of the Fool and Lear. Not literally, unless you want to. It's up to your...
Sure, why not? Why not? Well, we cross now over the threshold into the Armen roles. And the Fool is one I've done. Touchstone and Feste are great Armen roles that I have not done. And I have to say, I don't get them. When somebody's good on stage, I just forget all about it. But when I'm reading those plays and I'm reading Feste and Touchstone, I get lost in the longueurs sometimes. But the Fool in King Lear is a role I wanted to play since I was 17 years old when I first read the play, and would love to play again, except I'm too old. And interestingly, I think, though I've always identified with the role, I'm really not physically right for the storytelling of it. I'm too big. I always feels like the Armen roles are little guys throwing things into stronger, more muscular groups of people. But in any case, I think the Fool has these great things to say, but there's a real motive inside it. He's saying to the king, what have you done? You've upset the total apple cart. We're all done for now, and you don't get it. You think you're still king. So here's this wonderful set of lines. I remember speaking them to Sam Waterston. I marvel what kin thou and thy daughters are. They'll have me whipped for speaking true. Thou'lt have me whipped for lying. And sometimes I'm whipped for holding my peace. I'd rather be any kind of thing than a fool, and yet I would not be thee, nuncle. Thou hast pared thy wit of both sides and left nothing in the middle. Throughout the whole first half of the play, he needles his liege mercilessly and goads him, and it's like a Don Rickles act almost sometimes. What does this guy think he's still king? He gave away his land, boo! And it is just an amazing role because the things he says, you would think, okay, he's going to be out of there fast. He's the guy who hangs on with Lear. He and Kent and Edgar, they hang on together. And the Fool is a really weirdly mystical almost role. And I'd love to hear how anybody thinks he really ends, because I did the role, I still don't know. But he has, an actor playing that role has the advantage of having a lot of axe to grind. And he goes right up to the edge of his license and even beyond it. Sometimes King says, beware the whip, boy. As if, I'll whip you if you say too much. I can't remember the line, but Fool comes back to, yeah, you whip me. Anyway, so those are thoughts on Fool, and I'd love to hear. Jacob, have you done any role in Lear?
No, sir. I've never done Lear, but I agree with you. I think the Fool for me in Lear is so compelling, so very compelling.
We have 2 questions which might spur us further. One from Bill: how was the clown able to insult the king, to speak truth to power with no repercussions in the plays? And what was the Shakespearean message to his audience by staging such a dynamic? And I think a similar question from Carl: it would seem that there are 2 kinds of clowns: those who purposefully perform comedy and those who are actually serious but perceived as comical by others. And it's very striking that once you get to the Armin roles, you immediately have a completely different kind of, maybe not even a clown, maybe a fool, somebody who speaks in complicated images, somebody who has a kind of philosophical or cynical streak. The fool sings a lot more songs in the second half of Shakespeare's career. So right away, we see Shakespeare shift 180 degrees in the opposite direction. But what do you think, Richard, about, or Simon, about this idea of speaking truth to power?
His first role in The Lord Chamberlain's Men was as Touchstone in As You Like It. And Jaques is fiercely envious of him, declaring him a noble fool, a worthy fool, Motley's the only wear. And the Duke says he uses his folly like a stalking horse, and under the presentation of that, he shoots his wit. He also plays Feste in Twelfth Night. And he's wise enough to play the fool, as Viola recognizes. And that requires considerable wit. He's also spared by his boss from there is no slander in a licensed fool, says Olivia. So yeah, that was the authority, the license that a fool has, because after all, he's just joking. I inevitably think of Stephen Colbert being called upon to the White House Correspondents' Dinner and to entertain George Bush back in the days when they still held that. Trump, of course, has abolished that. But they, he really pushed the envelope.
I think this is fascinating just to speak to that, because I think that that in our history of tyranny or fascism, laughter plays no role. It's like the first thing to go. Like the clowns, the comics are out. And I find the question of King Lear's relationship with the fool, in seeing the play, we all feel, I think, great sympathy for King Lear by his closeness and tenderness to the fool. And it's sort of like when somebody accepts to be made fun of or to be challenged, we like them so much more. And I think that's how, and also with Hamlet, you will of course remember the most famous clown of all, whose skull we only ever see, that of Yorick. Hamlet speaks more tenderly about Yorick than he pretty much does anyone else in the play. And so there's, yes, something changes in our hearts towards people that allow, like Prospero, this thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. This thing of humor, I acknowledge mine. It's somehow the mantra of a person we care about, I think. Jacob.
Some people say that, I think Shakespeare was never thrown in the tower, one of the few writers that was never thrown in the tower. And some people say that relationship between the fool and Lear may be similar to Shakespeare's relationship with Elizabeth. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard.
You're just gonna put that on the table and let us all, the bombshell goes off. Speaking of Hamlet, we have a question about the gravediggers in Hamlet, which are sometimes called clowns or referred to as clowns. And there are also all these characters throughout the canon, really, who have clown-like characteristics, but who may not conform to the strict definition of fool or clown. I'm thinking of the porter, obviously, in the Scottish play. There are various and sundry. Iago, in many ways, kind of has clown-like characteristics. or Iago and Rodrigo are kind of like a weird clown duo in that play. Have any of you, Bill or Irwin, or Bill or Jacob, played these roles? And I'm wondering, Richard, if you could also address this problem of definition, really.
Well, I'll share this revelation I had recently, pretty recently. Every Thursday night, we go on Zoom, a few of us, and meet with a wonderful man, Ron Daniels, director, Shakespearean actor, and do a Shakespeare salon. And so I'm looking at the mysteries and the power of iambic pentameter, and I realize I've heard all this language all my life. Then it suddenly occurred to me, I've done scenes in verse, but I've never been in front of an audience in a Shakespeare play in any role but the clown roles, which are all in prose. And I'm not sure what it means, but it hit me hard that has been my wheelhouse. No, I've not played Iago. I've not played roles that I feel a great affinity to, but they just sit outside the clown wheelhouse.
But I'd like to speak to that because I think that's very, very interesting about, well, first of all, I suspect prose was easier to improvise in, which is why we have a lot of the clowns in prose, not verse. But I think there's something deeper in that which you're touching on, which is something I feel that when we speak about the good Shakespearean actor, I feel like what we could talk about is wit. And pretty much all of Shakespeare's characters are in some level witty, which is not to say that they are clowns, but they have a very clever, self-aware use of language and how that's going to change the person that they're talking to. And actually, I have a hunch that the best Shakespearean actors are often those who are funny. Because I think it's more easy to get people to cry when you've had a witty performer who is light of touch than you have a kind of heavy Shakespearean that sort of tries to wring you or push you or pull you and is not very witty. So in a way, I feel like Jacob, Bill, like these parts that we don't necessarily associate as being comic parts are actually very available to you. And you are the actors that I would like to see play them because of the lightness of touch that you learn from doing comedy.
Speak to my agent.
I will. Back to you, Drew.
We have a couple questions about As You Like It, and also some general questions about context. I think our viewers are really curious to know about the convention of having a clown in a play. Was this something that Shakespeare invented? Was it something that Marlowe or Johnson also did? Did Shakespeare use clowns in a different way from his peers or his contemporaries? Richard. You're muted.
I'm thinking. I don't recall. I think of someone like Barabbas in The Jew of Malta as a kind of clown-like figure who goes around poisoning nuns and all that. He's manic. He's just, a sheer force of destruction. I think of the porter in Macbeth, who is somewhat of a kindred spirit because he talks about if a man were a porter of Hell Gate, and sets the atmosphere for this hellish surrounding play. So, Johnson, of course, has, in a play like Volpone, he has plenty of commedia dell'arte figures, including Volpone taking on the role of a mountebank and performing as an entertainer, and seller of patent medicines. But he also has all these different contexts. So I'm sure that But I do think that the clown is in some ways unique to Shakespeare.
I mean, there is the character of, I'm thinking now of Wagner in Dr. Faustus, who is kind of the servant who absconds with Faustus's book and has all these prankish adventures. But I think you're right, Richard, that the clowns in these other Elizabethan plays do not have the prominence or the idiosyncrasy, individuality of Shakespeare. And it seems like we may be able to say that Shakespeare comes to a company where there are star clowns, or there's a star clown, and then replaces him with a star fool. And also over the course of his career, develops a kind of worldview or a dramaturgy based on the principles he discovered in collaborating with these clowns and fools. That, as Simon was saying, the trick of really breaking someone's heart is to make them laugh first, to kind of make them vulnerable, to make your characters relatable. We have a question from Jill, which I suspect Bill might know the answer to. When did clowns or fools start to paint their face or wear masks? It doesn't seem like something that Shakespeare's clowns do.
I wish I knew more about this. I was always told that clowns working or performers working at a great distance used white to be able to communicate further outside of a mask. I don't know. I just know that there is a power to the painted face that nothing else has, but it also, it contains its own boundaries. And I've tried to write pieces about this, about the putting on of makeup and then the being trapped within it. Marcel Marceau has a 2-minute piece that says it all. The Mask Maker, you get it on there, you can't get it off. I wish I knew better, but my whole life has been about it without knowing much about it.
And we do have references, Richard's raising his hand, we do have references to wearing motley, and Malvolio, of course, wears cross garters, which is kind of clown-like. And we have a question about Malvolio, sort of a comment really proffering him as an anti-fool, someone who is not humorous and whom the joke is indeed on in the play, who is dressed up and made to look like a clown against his will. Richard, I feel like you may be able to enlighten us here.
Well, I just was going to say that Malvolio is indeed deemed a kind of Puritan by Mariah, and as such is attacked. And he's dismissive of Feste, who gets his, comes back to bite him in the ass at the end by saying, thus the whirligig of time brings round its revenges. But I was just going to add that Commedia dell'arte specialized in masked performers. Arlecchino and all of those guys.
Exactly, and I think it would be fair to say that we think that if Shakespeare had seen the Commedia dell'arte, those troops in their masks, I think what Shakespeare was interested in is humanizing those characters. So essentially to internalize, to give them an inner life and a role in the story, so that the mask becomes somehow, digested, but the architecture is still somehow present. And I think with those characters like Malvolio, who are convinced of their own brilliance, it becomes very similar to the Capitaine, I think, in the Commedia, who's always telling enormous stories about their own prowess and sort of assuming greatness, greatness thrust upon them, or whatever, the greatness thrust upon us. So there's lines of Malvolio, which feels very similar to that ardent self-belief, which we realize to be, of course, perilous. And you're always close to disaster as soon as you proclaim your own genius.
Question I would like to ask Jacob from a commenter, citing Cheek by Jowl's podcast, where Declan Donnellan remarks on how a character is never in a neutral state, but actually trying not to explode or fall apart at all times, and that an actor should approach them in that way. Do you think this is true or useful for clown and fool roles?
Yes, I do think it's useful. I'm trying to do that in life, not to explode or fall apart. So I think it's a natural condition. I want to say something about Malvolio for actors out there. Try this if it works for you. Try looking at Malvolio as a natural fool. because he, you know, I think when I've seen it done that way, it's actually a lot of fun. He truly believes, you know, in this thing he's weaving, you know. It's a lot of fun.
We also have a question from James that I really want to know the answer to. And we're at the hour mark, so we should be wrapping up shortly. But who do you think is the most sinister clown in Shakespeare?
Well, can I throw the question on its head? There's something that either Shakespeare or Will Kemp or the two together knew how to do, and that was to set these dim characters and preposterous characters and really obnoxious characters in somehow a sympathetic light. And that was a gift that these other playwrights of the era did not seem to have. And Shakespeare seemed to know how to start a clown scene. So the young lovers and the patriarchs are there, and then two guys walk in and they walk a certain way and their pants go a certain way, and you're, okay, we're in a clown scene. And that's a gift that the playwright had as well as the performers he worked with. So I don't know even how to approach the question of who's the most sinister, because there's an aura of sympathy and dignity even that the clowns and the fools are given.
And indeed, when we talked about Othello and the Merchant of Venice in the Shakespeare Hour, and in Henry IV Part 1, we kept asking questions about the good and the bad and the characters. And what all the actors have said in the series is that there's no such thing as a good or a bad Shakespeare character, that they are all 100% human. That is how Shakespeare approaches them.
But I think, well, I was just thinking about how we've talked about Richard III as being funny until he's not funny anymore. And I think, and he himself even loses his own sense of humor, and the darker he gets. So I think sometimes Shakespeare uses wit or humor as a way of calibrating humanity. It's dangerous, but it's very seductive until it's not. And that point about ultimately when the king fires the jester, it's all over.
I think, Simon, you have just answered the question we asked at the top of the show about the clown whom Trump resembles most in Shakespeare. The character who is funny until he is all of a sudden not funny, and the character who insists on being the funniest character on stage to the detriment of everyone else in the world, perhaps.
Wow, thank you very much, Drew. Good to bring it round. I'll leave you to say goodbye, but yes, I certainly would love to say thank you, Bill and Jacob and Richard, for being part of such an wonderful panel, and to all of you for listening. And let me hand over to Drew to say goodbye.
Yes, next week we are featuring our largest panel yet for one of our largest and most ambitious topics. The theme is Shakespeare and America. And we will be joined by the artistic directors of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and the Guthrie Theater, Taki Garrett and Joseph Hodge, the OSF literary director, my counterpart, Amrita Ramanan, and actors Christian Camargo and Hamish Linklater. So this is truly a special episode that you will not want to miss. Tune in next week. From everyone here in DC, in my basement, good night to all.